welcome our guest today, Rolf Oberprieler. Rolf is a post-retirement honorary fellow at CSIRO, the Australian National Insect Collection in Canberra, where he's worked on weevil taxonomy for the last 25 years. So he's Australia's weevil specialist. But before moving to Australia in 1997, he worked at the South African insect collection in Pretoria for nearly 20 years, I think. 17. On how many? 17 years on weevils and other insects. So I think we're very lucky that Darwin and CDU can welcome Rolf today to talk to us about a rather special group of weevils I like to call poo weevils. So thanks, Rolf.
Thanks, Stephanie. I must admit I've never had the pleasure of being introduced by my daughter, but so this is the first one for me. Yes, about this talk, even though I'm presenting it and my name is first on the slide there as the presenter, most of the work was actually done by Hermes, my successor, as it were, at the Australian National Insect Collection, who's taking over the research of weevils for me. And he was actually up here last year as well when we were here and looking for Tentegia. And the three of us are together working on a revision of the genus, but Hermes is the driving force behind it. Now, when you think about dung beetles, you normally think about Africa, right? And you think about big animals like that, like elephants, and big animals every now and then do that. And when they do that, they do it very big as well. So elephant dung, when a poo ball comes out, is about that size. And it's nice and moist and juicy and fibrous, and there's a lot of nutrients in there. And that's very attractive to these guys, scarab dung beetles, which you probably know. And the first thing they do is they use their big front legs with long, sharp teeth to cut off a piece of the dung. And then they roll it into a ball and roll it away, because there are lots of other dung beetles at the dung ball, at the excrement. They roll it away, and then they hide it somewhat buried and lay an egg in it, and that egg develops into a larva, and the larva feeds on the dung. So that's the typical dung beetles in Africa and elsewhere as well. But what about Australia? I've never seen an elephant in Australia. And in fact, the largest thing that I normally see around here is a little wallaby like that. So in place of big juicy dung balls, wallabies produce that. Now that's miserable if you look at dung. It's small, it's dry, it's hard, it's, who wants to feed on that? And even more so, the arboreal ones, the possums, their dung pellets are even smaller. There's even less in it. There are, however, still quite a number of dung beetles in Australia, and they belong in the subfamily Scarabaeoidea, 334 species, 35 species, of which 200 belong in the cosmopolitan genus Ornithophagus. Now, Ornithophagus are fairly small beetles, and they are typically dung feeders. So the largest component of the Australian dung beetle Scarabaeoidea fauna is in the genus Ornithophagus. And other genera are supposed to have Gondwanan and Afrotropical affinity, but recent molecular research has indicated that their affinity is a bit shaky. So I'm not a specialist on dung beetles, so I can't tell you anything about the classification. And the biology of the Australian scarabs is also very poorly known. Many of them, as I said, in particular Ornithophagus, are coprophagus, so they feed on dung, but there are others as well that make balls out of decaying leaves, and some feed on fungi, as they do in other parts in the world, in Africa, for example. But what is apparently special about the scarabs in Australia is that some of them cling to the anus of macropods when the pellets are extruded. I've seen a photo, unfortunately I can't find it, where there's a whole bunch of little scarabs clinging to underneath the tail of a wallaby, or a kangaroo waiting for the dung to come out. Okay, now the superfamily Scarabaeoidea, which includes the true dung beetles, is a relatively primitive beetle group. This is a simplified phylogeny on the left there of all the Coleoptera, all the beetles. And the superfamily Scarabaeoidea fits in there. They're related to rove beetles and water beetles. There's about 35,000 species in the world. And it's divided into 12 families, of which the Scarabaeoidea, well, I can't say true dung beetles, but the one that contains, the family that contains the true dung beetles, comprises most of those species. And it's currently divided into about 16 subfamilies. And the true dung beetles, the subfamily Scarabaeoidea, contains about 3,800 species. Now, you probably wonder where the weevils appear on this phylogram, and they appear right at the bottom. They are, in fact, one of the most advanced beetle groups. They are sister group to the chrysomelids, the leaf beetles, and the longhorn beetles. They're also much larger. There are 60,000 species described. Some sources even put it up as high as 90 or 97,000, but I'm not quite sure where they get the number from. But it's a much larger group, and it's quite distant, so it's not related to scarabs at all. Weevils are a super diverse group. As I said, there's about 60,000 species described in probably 6,000 genera by now. But the estimate of the true numbers of species that occur in the world is at least 200,000, probably more. So there's about 3.5 undescribed species for every described species. So it's a huge group. It's one of the largest families of beetles and also of the entire animal kingdom. It's classified in 9 families, of which one is extinct. But I'm not going to bother you with any of these finer taxonomic details today. I just want to give you an idea of the variety of shapes and sizes that weevils come in. And yeah, their fossil record extends to the Upper Jurassic. So the oldest fossil we have is from the Daohugu Formation in China, if anybody knows where that is. They're not actually much older than scarabs. Scarabs are dated to about 140 million years ago, I believe. So they were certainly there in the, yeah, as I say, at the end of the Jurassic, when the dinosaurs were still roaming around. Okay. Do you know what a weevil is? Some do. Alan smiles, so he knows. I'm not going to go into many details. And of course, in a group that is as large as this, there are many, many, many exceptions. So, but just in general, weevils are characterized by having a long snout, a long rostrum, which is the anterior part of the face that gets elongated into a rostrum, and they use it mainly for, not for feeding, but for oviposition. So on the slide on the right, you can see 2 cycad weevils in Africa that feed on the seeds. And the top one here, this one is the male with the short snout. This one is the female with a very long snout. And she uses that long rostrum to drill into cycad cones, into the seeds inside female cycad cones from the outside. So she drills a hole into it, then she turns around and pushes her ovipositor into the hole, and conveniently the ovipositor extends to the same length as the rostrum, and she lays an egg inside, or actually several eggs in this case, and pulls the ovipositor out and seals the hole, and the next weevils are coming along. So that's why weevils have a long snout. The other character of at least all the higher weevils is a geniculate antenna, an elwood antenna. And some of you will know what an elwood antenna looks like. So I think we can classify ants as honorary weevils, because they are the only other insect group, as far as I know, that have elwood antennae as well. There are some decided advantages to having elwood antennae, also to do with oviposition, but I'm not going to go into that now. And the last characteristic feature of weevils is that they are endophytic. Their larvae live inside plant tissues, which is good for them, because inside plant tissues you have tissues that you can feed on reliably. You have a nice a soft and juicy environment, and you're relatively well protected from predators, from birds and wasps and so on. Not all wasps, of course, parasitic wasps can get to them. But these characters and combination, plus a few others, are probably responsible for the large diversity of weevils. In Australia, and this is my favorite slide, we currently have 4,150 weevil species described, and there may have been a few more added since I did that slide. If you compare that to the number of terrestrial vertebrates, there are in 2009, these are data from Chapman, the last inventory of Australian biodiversity. There were 2,358 terrestrial vertebrates, which are made up of reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians in those numbers, and 24,700 species of plants. Right. However, as I said before, weevils are grossly under-described. And we estimate that there are 20,000 weevils in Australia. In that scenario, there are 8.5 species of weevil for every species of terrestrial vertebrates in the country. So for every reptile, there are 22 weevils. For every bird, there are 24 weevils. For every mammal, there are 52 species of weevils, and frogs, 88. And even plants, the estimated number of plants in Australia is slightly higher than the one that is described. This is again an estimate from Chapman. So that means there's about one weevil species for every species of plants in Australia. So if you think about the diversity of weevils, you have to think of plants, not of other animals. Of vertebrates, weevils are an order of magnitude more diverse. Okay, the largest tribe of weevils in Australia is called Cryptorhynchini. That means hidden snouts. Cryptos means hidden, and rhynchos is the Greek for nose or for snout. And you can see it in the diagram on the right there. The weevils have a canal that stretches on the underside between their front and sometimes the middle pair of legs, and the weevil can just fold its rostrum into this canal, which gives it good protection. And it was obviously a good adaptation as well, because with over 1,000 species, that is in fact the largest tribe of weevils in Australia. And there are many more undescribed ones, especially these ones in leaf litter down here. They're very small and they look like tiny little acacia seeds or something. And wherever you go and you sample leaf litter, you're bound to end up with undescribed species, completely unknown ones. Cryptorhynchites are usually wood borers, some in dead wood, some in live wood. There are a few, like the mango seed weevil on the left, that feed on seeds, but by and large, they are wood borers. Now we come to Tentegia, which is a cryptorhynchite. And you don't have to look very far or venture out very far to find one. You just have to go to Holmes jungle, like Tissa did. And Tissa, in fact, founded Tentegia there some years ago. I can't remember how long ago that was. 2012.
It was the first one.
Okay, 10 years ago. So that's Tissa's Tentegia weevil in Holmes jungle. There are other species as well. I'll show you some just now. For example, at East Point, there's a different species, a smaller species, that apparently used to be very common in the 1970s and 80s, when I've been told there were lots of wallabies in that area. The wallabies have diminished in number, and Tentegia apparently as well. We looked for it last year when Hermes was here, and we didn't find a single one. I'm going to give you a brief taxonomic history, and I don't want you to get hung up on the details, but just to show how long we've actually known about Tentegia. The first species was described way back in 1775 by Johann Christian Fabricius, and it was unfortunately called Curculionoidea. I don't know why he called it stupidus. This is on the right. This is the type specimen, which is still in a collection in Copenhagen, in Denmark. He gave the origin only as New Holland, but we know that it was collected by Joseph Banks he was the botanist on Captain Cook's voyage in 1770 to Australia. And in fact, the paper by Fabricius, 1775, was the one that described the very first weevils from Australia, and Curculionoidea was one of them. So it goes back to 1775. Nothing happened for 100 years, and then a lad with the name of Francis Pascoe, who described lots of weevils and cerambycids and other beetles, he came along and he actually erected the genus Tentegia. He described two more species from New South Wales and from from Queensland. A German guy called Johannes Faust described 2 more species from Queensland. And then Thomas Blackburn, the Reverend who worked in the south in Adelaide, the South Australian Museum, he described the first 2 species from the Northern Territory, from the Finger Gorge and from La Murta. I don't know where La Murta is, but I know where the Finger Gorge is. So that happened in the 19th century. Then early last century, Arthur Lee, who was often described as the father of weevil taxonomy because he described about half of all the weevils in Australia. He described a couple of more species, and the ones in red are now deemed to be synonyms, because in 1994, my predecessor at the Australian National Insect Collection, Albert Zimmermann, he synonymized 5 of those names, so the red ones, leaving us with 9 valid species. And the revision that Hermes and Debbie and I are working on at the moment recognizes 3 additional ones, but they're not described yet. So in total, we know of 12 species of Tentegia in Australia. This is what some of them look like. This is apart from the one of the plates from the paper. So there's Amplipennis, the big one that occurs in the NG. That's the one that Tissa found at Holmes Jungle. A couple of other species. In some cases, you can see the 2 at the bottom one, that's male and female, so there's a bit of sexual dimorphism. The one on the right is confusingly called Tentegia, not Tentegia, but Tentegia. It's not closely related to Tentegia. I must put it in there. I'm not quite sure why, except that it looks similar. It's also Cryptorhynchini, but it's not Tentegia. And here are a couple of other species. There's Tentegia stupida, that's B, the one that was originally described by Fabricius. C, Tentegia tortipes, that is the one that was described from Darwin. And then the other ones are 2 new species that we're describing now. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation. Also in size, these are not quite to scale. We plotted the distribution map. I'm not going to show you all the maps, but just 2, actually 3 of them. So these are the distributions of Tentegia stupida, which is these purple dots here, which is distributed largely in Queensland, but it stretches into the Northern Territory, as you can see there. And then the red one on the left is Tentegia tortipes. That was described from Darwin, and as you can see, it occurs also in the Kakadu National Park, and probably more widely, but we just don't have any records. Similarly, 2 other species pairs. On the left, we have Amplipennis, that's the big one here. That's the one that Tissa found. And actually, Alan found it as well in your recent samples. So you can see it stretches from about Darwin in a sort of a band down into Queensland and into the desert. And again, the distribution is probably not completely assessed. The red one on the top is one of the new species. We only have it from Eastern Kakadu. I don't know why those records are all concentrated in that area, but that's all we know of it. And then on the right are 2 species that occur further east. There's B. signata, the one that has those 2 little white dots on the pronotum, which is a Queensland species, and Favosa in New South Wales. The other species are known for much fewer individuals, so the distribution records maps don't look as dense, as busy as this. So, interestingly, Tentegia only occurs in Eastern Australia. We have no records from Western Australia at all. And it occurs from Northern Victoria and South Australia into Queensland and the Northern Territory. Of the 12 species, half of them occur in the Northern Territory. So this is, Northern Territory is the epicenter, the hotspot, the diversity hotspot for Tentegia. Some species are only known from a few specimens, like Tentegia parva was described from a single specimen collected by one of the expeditions to Central Australia, and we only know it from the holotype. It's never been seen again. And as I hinted just now, the proper ranges of all the species are almost certainly not well known, that they would be larger than that. And it's also possible that more species occur in, for example, in the Kimberley area, but maybe also in the NT. So if you see moving dung pellets in the bush, keep your eye open, there may be a Tentegia behind it. Now we come to the biology, and there's actually not very much known about it. There's a single paper in the literature about the biology by Joseph Wessel, published in 1960. And he lived at a place called Silver Plains Station in Cape York, and he observed 2 of these weevils. That was in fact his only entomological paper, but it's made some fame. And so he found that Tentegia stupida, again, that species that was described in 1775 by Fabricius, rolling and pulling kangaroo and wallaby dung over distances of almost 2 meters under logs, fairly large logs. And he found that several individuals cached dung pellets under these logs. He found up to 3 individuals in those caches. He didn't record whether they're males and females. We presume that they're just different females that roll dungs under the same log, because there are not that many logs, and sort of do it communally. The female will then lay 1 egg in each of these dung pellets, and then the larva develops inside as well. And those are, in fact, some of the weevils that Russell reared out of the dung pellets that he collected. And B. signata, the smaller one, he didn't see that it rolled any dung, but he reared it from possum dung pellets. So these are the only 2 species for which we actually have biological information. Now we come to Undara, and this is what Hermes did earlier in this year. Undara, the Undara Volcanic National Park, you know where that is? In Queensland, south of Afan Tablelands. Very fascinating area, especially for the lava caves. And Hermes actually went there to look for a weevil, a blind, or should I say an eyeless weevil, that lives in the lava caves, deep in the lava caves, which we described last year. And he found some more specimens, but that's a different story. So there's Hermes, because he found some Tentegia as well. That's what you have to do to look at them. You have to lie on your belly on a little path, and then you can see them. If you're lucky, you don't find only one, you find them copulating and rolling dung. And Hermes took a series of photos to show how the weevil rolls the dung. The direction of the rolling is to the right and starts at the top. So it's quite a laborious practice. And actually what that looks like here. So that's a little video clip that Hermes shot when he was there, and Debbie put it together. So interestingly, they pull the dung pellet with their legs, and they use all their legs, but mainly the front and the middle legs, and use the hind legs to anchor themselves. It is quite similar to scarabs, except that the scarabs that I showed you earlier, the big ones that dig into the elephant dung and so on, they have very large and flattened front legs, which they use to cut pieces of the dung out. So when they roll it, they use these big muscly arms, as it were, and roll the dung backwards with their hind legs and their middle legs. But there are some scarabs also in Africa that feed on antelope dung, which is also smaller, and dung of tree hyraxes, for example. And they use a similar technique to this one.
So the weevils don't cut it, they take a whole pellet?
No, they use the whole pellets, yes. Partly because the pellets are small enough, and also they don't have the cutting legs. Hermes didn't ask him, you know.
Talk about Hermes or a weevil.
Both probably. You probably don't know Sisyphus, right? Sisyphus, the guy who was banished in Greek mythology, the guy who was banished to the underground and rolled a big stone up the hill, and every time he got to the top, it rolled down, and he had to start all over again. That's what this one looks like. Interestingly, in this sequence, the weevil is actually rolling and dragging up a dung pellet on a. This is one of these lava stones that occur at Undara. He's actually rolling it uphill. So this was a slanting piece of rock, and well, when I say he, it's probably a female. We don't know. Quite a job. So this is the first time that Tentegia has actually been filmed in action. We've never seen that before.
Do they just do it once, or does the female every day go find?
I wish I knew. We don't know. We don't know.
It's only 1/8.
Yes, as far as we know, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense because the larva will be slightly larger than that. No. All right. Conclusions. Tentegia are the only weevils in the world that roll dung. That does not occur in weevils anywhere else in the world. So Australia has a claim to fame here. And they do it very similar to the way that scarabs do. Except they don't bury the dung, which not all scarabs do either. But they roll it and they roll it into caches where they lay their eggs. Yeah, as I mentioned before, it's the method, the rolling is remarkably similar to scarabs, at least the ones that also roll the dung with their middle and hind legs. Unfortunately, we only know of this dung feeding or dung rolling behavior in 2 of the Tentegia species, 2 of the 12. We assume that it's likely that the others do so as well, but it's possible that they have slightly different habits, and they may not even feed on dung, they may feed on something similar, we don't know.
Well, I kept one of them for several weeks. I tried kangaroo pellets, didn't touch it. I used to give it water and it used to drink water.
Well, Amplipen is that big one that you collected here is also interesting morphologically because it's slightly different from the others. And we've actually been wondering whether it should be put into a separate genus. But I think we're going to leave it in Tentegia for the moment. So it is possible that it does not feed on dung. It's one of those species we just don't know. So that's where you come into. So you have to just find out what it does. And you collected, no, you put out some traps for them, right?
Yeah, and I was that failed.
And you failed miserably. Okay.
You see you're doing something.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's obvious that dung feeding or coprophagi in Tentegia involved from the wood boring habit of Cryptorhynchines, because that's what other Cryptorhynchines do. But exactly how it evolved and what the evolutionary drivers and pathways are, we don't know, because we haven't yet identified the closest relative amongst the Cryptorhynchini. We just know that Tentegia is a Cryptorhynchine. It's a fairly typical one, actually. But we don't know what it's related to, so we still don't know. But it's very unusual that a group of weevils that bores in wood then abandons that and starts to roll dung, which of course is plant fibers as well. But we also know nothing about possible interactions between Tentegia and the native Australian dung beetles. So we don't know whether they compete for the same dung pellets. As I said before, some of the Australian dung beetles cling to the anuses of wallabies and macropods and take the dung pellets from there as they're extruded. We assume that Tentegia won't do that. So whether there's a competition for dung pellets, whether the dung beetles take the fresh ones and Tentegia is left with the older, drier ones, we don't know. So there could be some resource petitioning. It's all still unknown. And also we know nothing about predators and parasites at this stage. There's a possibility also that there's kleptoparasitism, that when the weevils cache their dung pellets under a log, that someone else might come along like a scarab and steal them. It's a possibility, we don't know that. And then also, yeah, Remo said he saw quite a lot of fragments of Tentegia at Undara, and there were lots of cane toads as well. So whether the cane toads have any impact on these weevils. I should have probably said earlier that these weevils are flightless, they cannot fly, so they're very clumsy. They're quite hard, but very clumsy, and the cane toad would probably eat them quite readily. So we don't know that. Yes, and lastly, some acknowledgements. Tissa, of course, who was the one that set us off on this study of these interesting weevils. So I'm hoping that he can make some more contributions to that in due course. Jaime from ANIC and the park ranger Anthony for assistance with the fieldwork, and then Gavin and Alan and Jeff Marteith at the Queensland Museum for the loan of specimens. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a nice talk. I think everyone's going to be really excited to go out there and find wallaby dung and see if it's rolling around. Questions? Alan, you've got to talk into the microphone because there's people online.
Thanks, Rolf. I'll think a little bit more highly of weevils from now on. Can you say anything about the legs of Tentegia? Are they modified according to other Cryptorhynchines, given that they've got this sort of rolling habit? You mentioned they don't have the cutting front legs, but are the legs particularly long or something else about them?
In some species they are longer than in others, and they're also fairly thin and spindly. Many other Cryptorhynchines, the ones that I showed you earlier in this, on the slide that had a couple of different ones, they often have flattened legs that they sort of fold into the body to resemble a seed or something. Tentegia doesn't do that, so they have longer legs, which appear to be an adaptation for actually, grabbing and holding the dung pellets. But there are some other Cryptorhynchines that have similar legs. So, and they often use it. The ones that I've seen, for example, to cling onto branches. Often when you pick up a weevil, it actually clings very tightly to the twig or the branch that it's sitting on. So the legs are not vastly adapted, I would say, but until we know what the closest relative is or relatives are, we don't really know whether they have any special adaptations. So.
Sounds like a research project in the making.
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Acasio. I'm from Timor-Leste, East Timor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, hang on.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I hear that there are around 26,800 something weevils. That one is estimated in Australia live as a host for the plants. Did you already identify some weevils for consider as a biological agents to control exotic weed, or something we call that alien plant species?
Many weevils are used for biological control of weeds. In fact, weevils are some of the most successful biological control agents of weeds, in particular aquatic weeds. You probably have heard of water hyacinths, Eichhornia, water fern, Azolla, and many others, and these aquatic weeds usually have an origin in South America. So the weed biocontrol people then go to South America and they look for natural enemies of those weeds, not only insects, they look for moths and other beetles and so on as well, but often they pick weevils because weevils tend to be very host specific. And in Australia as well, several of these species have been introduced to combat aquatic weeds, but also other plants. And it's a continuum process. We have lots of weeds from aquatic weed from South America, temporal weeds from South Africa, for example, or Southern Africa, and others from Europe as well. Thistles, for example, I don't know whether thistles are a problem in Timor-Leste, but they're certainly in Australia. And several weevils have been introduced from usually the Mediterranean region, Greece and Morocco and so on, to combat those plants, those weeds.
Right. Thank you.
There's also, speaking about South America, there's actually also one weevil that we know of, one group of weevils that are carnivorous. They live on aquatic plants, but they don't feed on the plants. They feed on the eggs of aquatic grasshoppers. And these aquatic grasshoppers lay their eggs inside the stems of these plants growing in the swamps. And the weevils, they also have a very long rostrum. They actually parasitize the eggs and feed on the eggs. So weevils are quite adventurous, even though, as you know, we should all be vegetarians because it's good for us. And weevils do that too, but there's some of them that they're either predators or are feeding on dung.
Or does someone say good one? Just Jenny being kind to you.
No.
Thanks.
That's Jenny.
Any more questions about weevils?
Hi, my name is Prakash. I just want to know on possibility of weevils as a pollinator. Is there any possibility
Yes.
of weevil?
Yes, weevils are pollinators. Yes. In fact, one of the groups of weevils that I'm studying and at the moment with a student in Canberra is pollinators of cycads. You know cycads. Australia is also one of 4 areas in the world where cycads are pollinated by weevils. And in fact, if you go out through the complex of yellow buildings, there's a cycad here, with a male cone. And if you look inside, there's a little bit of crumbly bits and pieces. And I pulled the sporophyll out the other day, and there was a weevil larva in there. So there's a genus of weevils that lives in the male cones of cycads, the genus cycads in northern Australia, across to Queensland. And then further south, the cycads in the genera Macrozomia, Lepidozomia, and Bowenia, they're also pollinated by weevils. And cycads in Africa, in Asia, and in Central America are also weevil pollinated. There are other plants as well that are pollinated by weevils, palms, for example, including in the Mediterranean, by weevils in the genus, mostly in the genus Neurolomus. And in fact, there is a thing called the $1 million weevil. I don't know if you heard of the $1 million weevil. That's a weevil that pollinates African oil palms. So when the industry planted oil palms in Indonesia, this is about 20 years ago or so, they didn't get very far ahead because they couldn't propagate the palms. And then they went back to West Africa where the oil palm originates, and they found that there's a tiny little weevil that pollinates them called Eladobius. So they took these weevils and brought them into Indonesia, and where else African oil palms are planted now. And the result we have, unfortunately, well, it was called $1 million weevils because it made the industry billions and millions of dollars. Unfortunately, of course, it has the environmental consequences. So.
We've got $1 million barra.
Oh, really? But it doesn't pollinate anything.
Sure.
Weevils also pollinate many of the more primitive plants. Like nutmegs, for example, Myristica is pollinated by weevils. Custard apples, Anona, are pollinated by weevils. What else? And a couple of those more primitive angiosperms are weevil pollinated. Yes, so we do that as well.
The ones that get into hibiscus up here, are they pollinate?
They are in that same group that pollinates palms. Whether they do pollinate, we don't know. It's possible, but nobody has sounds like a project for you. Right?
Or another one.
Another one.
Just another question. Is there any nocturnal habit in weevils? Specific nocturnal habit?
Many weevils are nocturnal. The Cryptorhynchini are often nocturnal. During the day they hide and you almost don't see them, but if you put out a light trap, then they come to the light. Yes.
But he wants to go looking for wallaby down in the dark.
No, these ones are diurnal. You can have your beer in the evening.
The Tentegia that I kept was inactive during the day, come 6, 7 in the evening, started walking and he walked all night.
They walked all night.
Yeah, the ones I found that have jungle have been late in the evening.
Well, the ones that Hermes found, you saw those photos where he was lying on his belly and with a torch looking for him. That was late in the afternoon as well. But the paper by Wassel, he described them as being diurnal. So it's possible that there's some variation, some difference. So yeah, there's lots to find out.
Why do you think NT is the epicenter? Is that just because that's where more species have been found?
That's a good question, Steph. I don't know.
Good question. Right there.
Maybe because there's more crocodiles here or something. I don't know. At the moment, as I say, 6 of the 12 species do occur here.
So James has asked, I would like to know the specialization of beetles in respect to herbivores dung, and what might be the reasons, especially in African savanna, where there are a variety of large herbivore and different feeding habits.
What was the first?
I'd like to know if there are specialization of beetles in relation to the dung.
Yes, there are specializations. Again, I'm not a scarab expert, but there are some in the Namib Desert, for example, that feed on dung of oryx antelopes and so on, and they have different ways they don't roll the dung pellets, they actually drag them into shallow hollows in the soil. There are others that apparently specialized to feed on dung of hyraxes. There are in fact there's one genus called Scarabaeoidea in Africa that has moved away from dung feeding and feeds on rotting millipedes. And in Africa you get big millipedes like this, and the beetles actually, they go along, and if they find a dead one that's been crushed by a cow, so they actually cut it up into tiny little chunks, and then they drag these chunks away and lay their eggs inside. So it's not a specialization of dung anymore, it's something else. But yeah, further specializations in Africa to dung. Size obviously plays an important role as well. These big dung pads or dung pellets from elephants and rhinos and so on, they obviously have more food, so they attract the very large ones. And there are also differences. Some roll balls, others just take a piece of dung and bury it straight underneath the dung heap, so they don't roll it. And there are smaller ones as well. So there's a whole suite of dung feeders that utilize the dung.
Is it sort of, I think the question may be asking, is there an ecological benefit to using the dung? I mean, like a food source that's widely available, easy to get.
Yeah. And again, it's a it's a food substrate. It's half digested plant material, which is if you can utilize it, there's nutrients to extract, and this is probably what the weevils do as well.
And available all year round.
Yeah, more or less. Yep.
Cool. The question?
Said that they weren't to scale. Is there a significant size difference for the species?
Of Tentegia.
Yeah, or they are very similar size?
No, they are different. Amplipennis is the biggest one. It's about like a centimeter long. And the smallest one was described as parva from the Finke Gorge in central Australia. Is I think it's about 3 or 4 millimeters long. So there are size differences. But because we don't know what the smaller species do for a living, whether they utilize dung as well, we don't really know.
Do you theorize that their size is related to the dung pellet size that That's it.
Possibly,
Yeah.
possibly. I mean, marsupials come in all sorts of sizes as well. So maybe the small species utilize the dung of little.
That's the red kangaroo, Tentegia, you know.
Yeah.
Monster.
It'd be a big one.
You can turn it around as well. You can ask what was the situation when the diprotodons were around in Australia.
Is it coincidental that the number of weevils is roughly the same as the number of plants?
Do you want a creationist answer here or? No, I don't think so. Well,
What are you suggesting? There's one weevil that attacks every plant species in Australia?
yes, some people have suggested that. In fact, my mentor and guru, Willie Cushel in New Zealand, he reckoned that there's one species of weevil for every plant species in the world. It's not quite that simple because there are a lot of plant species that have more than one weevil species, and there are probably also some like ginkgo, for example. Ginkgo is a tree that is very resistant to insect attack. As far as I know, it doesn't have any weevils associated with it. But cycads certainly do, conifers do. There are also weevils that feed on mosses and cryptogams. There's even a what do you call it, a semi-marine weevil on the subantarctic islands that feed on cryptogams, on algae and cyanobacteria. So we do that as well. So maybe it's just a coincidence. There's obviously some, if you're a group of animals or beetles that are specialized to feed on plants, then the diversity of plants is your oyster. You can, diversify and feed on as many plants as there are, basically, or more.
Basically, weevils could rule the world.